Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Tracy Bruner. I'm a cattleman from Central Kansas, currently serving as president of National Cattlemen's Beef Association. I'm pleased to welcome you to NCBA's webinar on what is a very timely topic for many people making bull purchases and breeding plans for the coming spring. The title of the webinar this evening is Making a Positive Genetic Impact on Your Herd. As a participant tonight, your line will be muted, but please feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen. And at the end of the presentations, questions will be moderated to our presenters by Josh White. Josh is the leader of our NCBA producer education team. If you have trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at beefusa.org. With several speakers joining us from around the country, bear with us as we change control of the presentation during the course of the webinar. There may be a brief pause in the discussion. Have patience. We have outstanding speakers who will provide the most up-to-date information on beef cattle genetics. Our speakers tonight include Dr. Jared Decker, who is Assistant Professor in Animal Science and Beef Genetics Extension Specialist at the University of Missouri. But we're going to start our discussion tonight with Dr. Bob Weber, who is an Associate Professor in the Department of Animal Sciences and Industry at my alma mater, Kansas State University. Dr. Weber, thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Tracy. It's a real pleasure to be on the webinar tonight, and certainly a pleasure to have you hosting us as one of our Kansas own here, and we sure appreciate the chance to be with you. One of the sort of frequently asked questions I get regarding beef genetics these days, and maybe a little surprising to the audience, is still discussion about the use and really the value of crossbreeding or heterosis in the beef value chain. And this may be one of the topics that's discussed and cussed around coffee shops and pubs around the country, but certainly one that's important for our industry to keep sight of as we strive to continue to meet a number of objectives in our business. As many of you are obviously aware, as beef producers, we're a segmented business in the United States in terms of our beef business. And that means there's lots of players and lots of objectives and goals to meet as we strive to ultimately meet the consumers here domestically and around the world with a high quality and nutritious beef product. And when that happens, obviously customers appreciate our product, but important for each of us as beef producers is that we do that in a profitable and environmentally sensitive way that provides, again, this high quality nutritious product for our customers. And with that in mind, we face a number of challenges moving forward in our business. One of the ones, and certainly recently at the NCBA convention in San Diego, we heard lots of buzz about discussion of sustainability, and certainly NCBA has been a leader in sort of helping our business document our improvements and step changes in sustainability. But among those issues that affect sustainability are land use, certainly profit as it relates to us as producers remaining in a management role of the landscapes around the United States, petroleum use, animal welfare, some social concerns related to antibiotic and growth promoting use, change in climate, and maybe in that list I'll lob one in that's maybe lack of communication between sectors within our business and understanding who our consumers are domestically and around the world. And as we think about those topics, one of the ones that I want to help elevate in our discussion today is really how do we improve production efficiency? Ultimately, changes in production efficiency, particularly at the cow-calf level, augment our sustainability and certainly the story that we can tell to our consumers And part of that improvement in production efficiency comes through genetics. And we'll talk specifically about heterosis or hybrid vigor, but certainly as one area of genetic improvement and genetic merit. But certainly the use of EPDs and selection index, and Dr. Decker is going to talk about some genomics tools later in the webinar, all provide mechanisms for us to change the genetic merit of the livestock we produce for a whole host of traits that are economically important across the beef value chain. And we'll spend a little bit of time here this evening talking about the value of heterosis in that regard. So one of the questions that comes up is, well, we've made dramatic changes in genetic merit across a majority of the major U.S. beef breeds in the States for a whole host of traits. Do we still need to leverage and utilize heterosis or crossbreeding? And that sort of motivated me to think about those topics, and I've put together a slide here that I call the crux of straight breeding. And the decision to straight breed or crossbreed really comes down to, I think, these sort of pieces. And it's, do the benefits of selection for an economically important or convenience traits within breed, i.e. straight breeding, outweigh the improvement in lowly heritable traits via heterosis or hybrid vigor, especially maternal heterosis? And as we value and evaluate the differences in productivity and profitability in straight breeding and crossbreeding systems, this is really the question we have to answer. So as you evaluate your own breeding system as a producer, it's important to think about these and what the trade-offs are, the things you give up or capture in either of those two alternate breeding systems. Ultimately, though, what we need to think about as commercial beef producers is that we should really select for both additive and non-additive genetic merit. What I mean by that is we should select for the traits that we can influence via EPDs and selection index, traditional tools for genetic improvement. But also we should think about our breeding system and design it in such a way that we get to leverage the non-additive or heterotic or heterosis, hybrid vigor, if you will, genetic merit that's available to us. And we'll talk about why we should do that. So again, we need to focus as commercial producers on both areas of genetic merit in our beef production system, the additive and non-additive bits. And if we're seed stock producers, and I suspect a number of them are online, and Tracy, I know your family's in the seed stock business as well, that we should really focus on additive genetic merit, and then take that genetic merit and put it in a package that helps our clientele exploit genetic merit in terms of non-additive effects or heterosis effects. So that might be producing purebred bulls to go as terminal sires on a set of crossbred cows, as an example, or it may mean producing hybrid bulls of a couple of different breed types combined to make it an easily exploitable package and delivery mechanism for our commercial producers. Okay. One of the reasons that we really think about heterosis as a useful genetic improvement tool in sort of a non-traditional sense is that the effects of heterosis are really inversely related to heritability. And so traits that we have, like carcass traits or growth traits that have moderate to high heritability, we have effective tools to influence the genetic improvement of those via EPD or selection index. But for traits like fertility that have low heritability estimates, we're very limited in the amount of genetic improvement we might be able to make in reproductive efficiency or fertility. Heterosis actually has a very big impact, a positive impact in terms of reproductive rate in our cow herd. And so we can use these two sets of effects or traits really in a complementary kind of way. So we've talked a little bit about heterosis already. What is it? Well, commonly known as hybrid vigor, where it's that extra little boost of performance we get in crossbred calves as compared to the average of the straight bred parents. And it's been shown through a variety of research trials that the more divergent the parental lines are in terms of their genetic background, the more heterosis they produce. For example, a Bos taurus, Bos indicus, or so a sort of say a British breed crossed with a Brahmin breed, or a Bos indicus breed, produces about 3 times as much heterosis as a typical Bos taurus cross, like say Hereford and Angus, for example. It's also important to note that heterosis, by definition, is not available from within breed matings, regardless of maybe how far apart those lines are within a breed. They're still not as far apart as different breeds are. And this is a topic that's been extensively researched, not only in cattle, but a variety of livestock and crop species. I did a Google search in Google Scholar, which sort of sorts through the scientific literature, in excess of 13,000 manuscripts that address heterosis or hybrid vigor in beef cattle. So where does the power of crossbreeding come from? It really comes in two areas. We can think specifically about heterosis, and especially maternal heterosis as the one area. And then if we build the system correctly and we are able to leverage different breeds and put them together in an intelligent way to leverage the strengths of one breed to fill the shortcomings of another, method we call breed complementarity, we have two areas then, heterosis and breed complementarity, that add value to our production system. So it's not only about putting breeds together, it's about putting those breeds together in a planned and intelligent way, and in the right order, so we have the right sets of breeds in the maternal side, and the right terminal traits in the sire breeds to produce calves for market, to leverage that kind of breed complementarity. Some really recent work demonstrates that heterosis is alive and well. We've had a lot of discussion over the last couple of years about, well, since breeds are more similar in terms of their genetic performance, have we lost heterosis? And Matt Spangler, a colleague of Jared and mine at University of Nebraska, did some work with contemporary data and demonstrated that heterosis estimates are at least as big as they have been historically, if not a little bit bigger. So we've gathered more data and demonstrate that, in fact, heterosis is alive and well in our beef system. And one of the interesting sort of developments regarding sort of new research in heterosis is a little bit of shift in our view of where heterosis comes from as an effect that we can leverage genetically. For many years, we thought that that source was really a function of just changes in allele frequencies or heterozygosity in the population, or different copies of genes in terms of dominance effects. One way to think of it was sort of the opposite of line breeding or inbreeding, sort of the inverse of those two. And we know from a lot of research in inbreeding and line breeding in the 1950s and 60s that those inbred animals are actually less fit across production environments as compared to crossbreds, and that sort of helps sort of conceptualize our idea of this increase in heterozygosity makes animals perform better. Well, with new genomics and sequencing data available, Dorian Garrick at Iowa State and Jerry Taylor at Mizzou, and I think, in fact, Dr. Decker's been involved in some of this work as well, suggests that as we go through the genome, we find within breeds and certainly within animals, locations where we have genes that are broken or have a decrease or loss of function. And it's been hypothesized then that actually heterosis is driven by recovery of gene function when we produce animals that are components of two or more breeds. It's unlikely then that these loss of function mutations have developed at the same location across breeds, and so that when we cross animals, we may be able to get improvement in performance. So as a little bit of a picture example here to help sort of cement this in our head how it might work, is that we've got these two animals, sire and dam, here from two different breeds. And let's hypothesize then the red bars represent a specific chromosome, and the little prohibited signs locate a particular broken gene that this sire has, and that he has a complete loss of function. So the gene product that is made from that transcription isn't functional in the biology of this critter. It doesn't kill it, it just doesn't work very well or at all. And let's say we mate that then to a dam that has two good genes, two functional genes at that same locus. When we produce progeny then, we get progeny that are half the genetic makeup of the sire and half of the dam, and in this case then we have heterozygotes, one good copy and one bad copy of this particular gene. As we think through the sort of expression of those genes then, what we find is that the sire has no functional gene product because he has two broken copies. The dam, she's okay because she has two good copies. And then it turns out that the progeny, it's okay too. It has a little better performance than certainly the sire does because it's at least got one good copy. And having one good copy may provide as much expression and performance as having two good copies. Sometimes dosage makes a difference in some of these genes, but certainly having one good copy is better than having 0 good copies. And so one of the things we think that may be happening in building crossbreds then is that we get away from animals that are homozygous for these loss of function mutations within breed by introgressing, if you will, a good chromosome that has a functional copy of that gene in the F1s. As we think about subsequent generations, though, we may find animals where we have what we call recombinant loss. So we may actually go, if we cross animals that are the genotype of this progeny together, we would produce about a quarter of those that are homozygous for the broken copy, a quarter of them that are homozygous for the favorable copy, and half the population would be heterozygotes just like this. And that explains what we observe then and fits the paradigm of what we see in terms of the distribution of performance relative to the F2s or subsequent generations that are intersay mated of these crossbred animals. Okay. So what are some of the advantages, kind of back to the cowboy talk here? Some of the advantages of crossbred cows that are really important from our production system include longevity. We see from about 25,000 matings summarized in this paper by Cundiff and Gregory in the late 90s, about a 16% improvement in longevity, which is about nearly a year and a half. Longer productive life of crossbred cows relative to straight bred cows in the same production environment. In that additional lifespan, then, those cows produce about 1 more calf on average and had a cumulative weaning weight improvement of about 600 pounds per cow. Okay, so this obviously impacts sort of the weaning weight per cow exposed metrics that we use as efficiency measures in the cow-calf side. Certainly some benefits from having crossbred calves as well. So they have a little better calving rate, survival to weaning's a little bit better, maybe not quite as favorable as a little bit of an increase in birth weight, about 2%. Weaning weight, about a 4% improvement. Average daily gain or efficiency, about a 2.5% improvement. And yearling weight, again, about a 4% improvement. The thing that's important to recognize here is that the real value in our crossbreeding system comes from having crossbred cows. This plot here on the right demonstrates in terms of percentage of increase in weaning weight per cow exposed, or a common production metric we use to describe system levels efficiency in cow-calf operations. We find then that about 2/3 of the economic benefit of crossbreeding actually comes from having crossbred cows, and about 1/3 from having crossbred calves. This should motivate us then to think about how do we get and maintain crossbred cows or maternal heterosis in our production system, and this becomes one of the more challenging pieces of our crossbreeding strategy, is figuring out how to keep a relatively high level of heterosis on the cow side. Some important things relative to motivators are its impact on profit. If we think about crossbreeding as a tool, we should expect a return on investment from that tool, and certainly many of those returns end up being very positive from a heterosis standpoint. One simple example is to think about replacement heifers and cow longevity issues in the cow herd. If we think about crossbred cows living longer, that means we need fewer replacements in our production system, and fewer replacement means a decrease in costs. We know replacement heifers are one of the largest cost centers of beef production, so decreasing those costs by itself would increase profit if we held revenue constant. The beautiful thing, though, is that what happens to cull heifers? Well, they go to town with their steer mates, so we actually see not only a decrease in costs in our system when we crossbreed from a replacement heifer standpoint, but we also see an increase in revenues because we have more pay weight that goes to town in terms of generating revenue capacity. And so by definition, if we increase revenue, decrease costs, we increase profit. Just as an example, one of the things that's I think hard for people to conceptualize is the idea that we'll almost always implement these systems across our whole herd. So we don't hardly ever have a straight bred herd and a crossbred herd in a commercial situation standing side by side to measure those differences. So to help sort of conceptualize that, I put together this numeric example a few years ago and just updated it recently. And that example is if we have 2 herds, each with 100 cows, the straight bred cows in the system or one herd, crossbred cows with the other herd. We start off with about an 80% weaning rate, 575-pound average weaning weights, and a 10-year time horizon. Anytime we make breeding and selection decisions, we ought to look at that in the intermediate to long term. If we think about that then in terms of improvements, 6% improvement calf survival to weaning is about 48 head, half a pot load of calves. Weaning weight, a 4% improvement from the direct component, about 18,000 pounds or half a pot load of calves. If we take all the improvements together, and I shared a couple of lists a bit ago, and use the weaning weight per cow exposed measurement of an increase in productivity, the crossbred system measured at 23%, which happens to be the low value in the literature for an F1 terminal sire system. Some of the estimates range nearly to 30 or 35%. I like to be conservative, so that system then produces from crossbred cows and crossbred calves, just due to heterosis, not to breed complementarity or anything like that, just the heterosis part, an additional nearly 106,000 pounds of calf weight in that 10-year time horizon. Same resources used, 100,000 pounds more calf output. Okay? If we boil that down into current value in terms of calves marketed, that additional pay weight is worth about $200 per cow per year. Okay? Said another way, that amount of revenue off 100 cows would enable you to buy every third year with cash a brand new Dodge Chevy. We'll use Dodge, they're a big supporter, NCBA. Dodge Dually Crew Cab Diesel, decked out, tricked out, nice as you could make one, with cash every 3 years. That's the difference. Okay? If you like to be more scientific, break-even costs decrease by about nearly 40 cents a pound of the crossbred calves over the straight-bred calves. Another way is to think about it is, well, how much more money would the straight-bred calves have to earn per head to be equivalent to the productivity of the crossbreeding system? When you do that math, those straight-bred calves have to generate $264 per head additional to be equivalent in the value generated by the crossbred system. Okay? So one of the questions I get frequently, well, what if I try and retain ownership and capture value from the far end of the value chain, straight breeding and trying to capitalize on high value carcasses, and give up give up heterosis or crossbreeding to get there? How much money do I have to make additional on those steers? Well, it's about $264 a head. So most of the grids I'm aware of pay about 10%, maybe 20% of that value. Would be a pen that really rings a bell. So it's important that we make sure we make good economic decisions as we think about implementing our breeding system. Things to think about. Many of you are probably wondering, well, is Weber going to tell us what's the best crossbreeding system to use? And I'm sad to tell you I'm actually happy to tell you I'm not going to tell you that because it makes a difference on how big your herd is, what the current breeding system is, the breeds represented in that population. Those all influence what in your labor availability, marketing endpoints, all influence not only what breeds but what system you should use. But some sort of general guidelines as we think about breeding system include how do we optimize the utilization of both calf and maternal heterosis, remembering that 2/3 of the economic value of crossbreeding comes from crossbred cows. How do we use breed complementarity to match cows to our production environment and their progeny to market targets? If we think about the end product in terms of breed composition, there are lots of different ways to get there. Design the system so that you get cows that are the best cows that they can be in terms of the breed complementarity on the maternal side, and then use the sire selection to influence traits that are of market importance in that calf product. Another thing, number 3 here, is minimize variation in progeny phenotype by stabilizing breed inputs. What this means is if you're a small producer and sell calves conventionally, you need to be pretty careful about the different types and kinds and colors and sizes of calves you produce, because that influences your marketing capability. If you're a big producer and run 3,000 or 4,000 head of cows and have them divided up into 1,000 cow units, your ability to manage variation is much enhanced by a tool called sorting and loading them out in load lots. So heterosis has different implications depending on size and scale of your operation. And lastly here is how might we use advanced reproductive technologies like estrus synchronization and AI, gender-sorted semen, to help build our structured breeding plan to build these high-quality crossbred replacement females. And there's certainly some opportunities emerging in that regard. I want to emphasize the concept of retained heterosis, or that heterosis we get to keep in our cows. Because again, 2/3 of the value comes from that in terms of extended cow longevity and fertility. And so one of the questions we kind of get is frequently is if we make crossbred animals, or say make two F1s that are half each of two breeds, together, do we have zero heterosis? And the answer is no, we don't have zero heterosis. We have a reduced amount of heterosis that's proportional to the change in breed fractions and probability of combining like genetics from a breed. So if we mate those two F1s together, we actually end up with half of the heterosis of the original F1. But we do retain heterosis into future generations, and so we can design systems that enable us to capture frequently not all of the heterosis of the true F1, but a majority of it in a relatively simple way. How do you choose a breeding program then? Well, one of the things to really sit down and think about is, are you really profit-minded? So do you keep track of your costs and revenue and have a good idea what your break-evens are and your cow herd performance and where you might need to make improvements? Or are you primarily premium-focused? Do you just use the revenues and premiums you might generate at the sale barn or through a packing system as a proxy for profit, which I'll argue to you is not a great way to measure profit. Measuring profit directly is better. But ultimately, why can't you be both? We need to think about systems that not only enhance our production efficiency, but also enhance the value of the product we produce. And certainly, crossbreeding and genetic improvement don't have to be mutually exclusive sort of events. Herd size obviously plays a big role. We mentioned that just a minute ago. Making sure you have efficient utilization of your bull power, how you manage variation in your marketing groups. Certainly if you're a small producer that maybe has 25 or 50 head of cows, a 3-breed rotational crossbreeding system probably isn't going to work very well for you because you get lots of management influence for a relatively small number of cows, 3 breeding pastures required, and so on. Simpler systems may be actually much more appropriate to you. How do you generate replacement heifers? This is a key one because it enables us to decide how much influence we need to place on maternal traits. If you buy replacement heifers and you can source high-quality F1 crossbred heifers, a terminal sire system becomes very effective and very simple to manage. If you have one breeding pasture, you sell all the calves. Okay. How do you market those calves? Certainly plays a role in terms of not only the traits that are important, but how you might manage the variation in those traits, and certainly in terms of coat color and other issues that may affect you plays a role. Environmental and management constraints outside of that, including breeding pasture, ability to identify animals, and so forth, plays a key role. Ultimately, the success you may have in breeding crossbreeding systems is dependent on your ability to do what I call the $500 an hour work versus $5 an hour work. And that's really to sit down, evaluate your herd and the records that you have available, and build a plan and set attainable goals about the areas you want to improve and leverage from heterosis. Again, considering marketing endpoints, replacements, environment, and management. Seek advice from people that are knowledgeable and have the background and experience to help guide you in building an effective breeding system, whether that's a straight breeding system or a crossbreeding system. That advice is good. And lastly here, stick to it. Too often, and certainly as we think back to the 70s and early 80s, we had crossbreeding, we had a lot of it, it just wasn't very well planned. I advise you, once you've got a plan, unless you have good empirical data that suggests you're way off track in terms of your system, that you stick to it and see it to fruition. So that advice, I think, will pay dividends as you move forward in your breeding program. I know this is a lot of information really fast, so I'll point you to an additional resource you may find useful. A number of years ago, some colleagues and I put together this publication as part of our work in the National Beef Cattle Evaluation Consortium, and it's called the Beef Sire Selection Manual. It's available electronically. It has about, 12 or 14 different chapters in it that range from cow herd assessment, goal setting, resource assessment, breed selection, breeding program, crossbreeding, use of EPDs, DNA markers, indexes, and so forth, available here at the address on the bottom, nbcec.org. Or if you're a Googler, just simply Google Beef Sire Selection Manual, and this is the first one that comes up on the list typically. Real quickly, before I hand off to Dr. Decker, as a quick invite, we have the privilege here at K-State of hosting the Beef Improvement Federation's annual meeting and research symposium here in Manhattan, Kansas, June 14th through 17th, headquartered at the Hilton Garden Inn. We've put together, with our assistance from the BIF board, what we think is a great program that focuses on two really important areas. The first one is, as program highlights go, opportunities for the beef value chain. Can we become more coordinated and more profitable? So looking at our beef system and where we need to be 20 years from now, what the food business is going to look like in terms of our consumer demand and what they want, and then certainly how do we make some improvement, particularly on the meat side, to meet some of those demands. That'll be the focus of the first day's general session. On the second day, in the morning, we'll spend the time reflecting on the first day's talks and talking about protecting producer profit for the future. So evaluating kind of where our cow herd is at nationally in terms of a variety of production attributes, things that we've learned from the feeding sector and what drives profit from the cow-calf side into that system. How do we grow profit by understanding maintenance efficiency and maintenance requirements in our animal systems? And then finally, how do we make our cow herd more efficient and profitable by 2036? So we hope you'll join us here in Manhattan in June. Watch the BIF website or beefimprovement.org for more details. With that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Decker. I'll look forward to a number of questions, hopefully, as we get to the end. And Jared, you should have the ball.
All right, thanks, Bob. So tonight I'm going to talk about some new genetic technologies that we have in the beef industry. If you're part of beef production, you're probably aware of these things. What we want to accomplish tonight is really talk about why what we're doing now is different from what we've done in the past, and also to talk about, how to best use these. So basically what I'm going to talk about is how genetic technology has changed over the last several decades, what genomic technologies are available and how we can use them, and then talk about some of the ways that genomics delivers value to the beef industry. So first, let's talk about how it's changed. There's this concept called the scientific hype cycle. And basically what we have is we have some sort of technology trigger. That trigger develops new products and platforms. There's a lot of hype about those new technologies and really overhyped. So then the technology doesn't live up to its billing. So consumers get disillusioned, disappointed with the technology, but then what we see happen is continue research and development of that technology, and we actually see the technology tweaked in a way that it's valuable to the industry and to the consumers. And then after we go through that second phase of research and development, we reach an area where we have a plateau of productivity. So I'm going to go through this hype cycle and talk about how it applies to DNA technology in the beef industry. So in the 1970s to the 1990s, we had various DNA technologies that were developed. We developed better ways to sequence DNA molecules. We identified different types of DNA variants, DNA markers. But these early methods were really slow and labor intensive. It took a long time to generate a small amount of data. But even with these kind of early technologies, we still had what I'll refer to as gene test marketed to the beef industry. And those of you who have been around for a while, you're completely familiar with what I'm talking about here. You know, in the 90s, if you opened up a beef journal, a beef magazine, a beef industry magazine, you would see some sort of ad about these gene tests being marketed. But what academics like myself at that time asked is, do these DNA technologies, are they actually providing value to the beef industry? And so then I want to talk a little bit about what it actually costs to generate DNA data. So in 2001, when this was going on, it cost about $5,000 to sequence 1 million base pairs of DNA. The other important thing to note in this time is that these three researchers, Mewison, Hayes, and Goddard, published a paper on what they called genomic prediction, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. So in the mid-2000s, what we saw happen is that most of these commercialized tests, with a few exceptions, failed the validation step. So those DNA technologies that were marketed in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, they weren't really providing value to the beef industry. They weren't delivering on the marketing hype. There's a couple of reasons for this. One of the reasons is that there were some assumptions made when those tests were designed that there were a small number of genes that were affecting these complex traits that like weaning weight or milkability or calving ease or marbling. And that assumption of a small number of genes influencing these complex quantitative traits really didn't reflect the actual biology, how the genes and the number of genes that were influencing those traits. The other thing that happened is, rather than data guiding the researchers to which genes should be included in these gene tests, the researcher would pick a gene based on their knowledge, based on a literature search of what research had been done previously, and kind of some of their own intuition about which genes they should target as they do these gene tests. And so that was also problematic, is that the researchers picking the genes rather than the data identifying which genes should be part of that test or part of that prediction was also problematic. In 2006, there was a new DNA technology that came about, marketed by a company called Solexa, and it was later purchased by Illumina. And what this allowed us to do is to sequence a large amount of DNA for a fraction of the price that we previously used. So in 2006, that sequencing cost was about $600. What that decrease in sequencing price allowed us to do is to identify a large number of DNA markers. And most of those markers are what we call a SNP. You might be familiar with that. It's basically just a location in the DNA of animals where they vary by a single base pair. Okay. The other thing that I'll note is in 2008, the cost to sequence 1 million base pairs of DNA is down to a little less than $4. In 2009, that sequencing cost continued to drop. And there was also a tool for researchers to use that we call a reference genome sequence. And so this is kind of the framework on which all kind of genetic and genomic analyses are built upon. It's a research that's really commonly used and really allows you to go to the next level, the next step in terms of genetic and genomic research. So those genome assemblies were published in 2009. The other really kind of important thing that happened in 2009 is that the dairy industry implemented what we call genomic selection or genomic prediction. When we use genomic prediction compared to the gene test that I talked about earlier, instead of accounting a handful of genes, 1 or 2 genes or a dozen genes, now we're going to take the entire DNA of the animal into account. In 2010, the Angus Association followed suit in terms of the development that we had seen in the dairy industry. So Angus started using genomic predictions to produce genomic enhanced EPDs. That cost of sequencing is down to about 30 cents per million base pairs. In 2012, we saw several other of the beef breed associations also publish and release genomic predictions and genomic enhanced EPDs. And now that cost of sequencing is down to about 7 cents. In 2014, we're down to about 5 cents. And so since 2001, the cost of that sequencing has dropped 5 to 6 orders of magnitude. And so this is just another way to look at how the sequencing cost has dropped over time. And it's really quite incredible. If we actually look at 2015 numbers, that price has continued to drop again, and we're down to about 2 cents per a million base pairs. And so this really opens up questions that we can ask, and I'd point you to a post on my blog where you can kind of learn more about the type of research that we're doing now, because sequencing DNA has gotten cheaper. But typically the data that you all receive isn't DNA sequence data, it's DNA genotype data. So instead of looking at all 2.6 billion base pairs, we look at 50,000 DNA variants or maybe 150,000 DNA variants equally spaced across the genome. And so now instead of gene test kind of method or the gene test paradigm where we look at a couple of dozen genes, 2 genes, 100 genes, whatever it is, with genomic prediction, what we're basically trying to do is take the entire genes of the animal, the entire DNA of the animal into account as we use the DNA technology to create measures of their genetic merit, measures of their EPDs. And so basically what happens is for each of the variants that we have tested in these animals, we estimate basically an EPD for the different alleles. So here, this variant, looks like some of my negatives got dropped. Anyways, this was supposed to be a negative 0.1 associated with this B variant at position 1, and this A variant at position 1 is a positive 0.1. And we can do that for all of the positions that we have in our genomic prediction. And so then when we sum up all of these effects, we end up with a molecular breeding value of 2.2. Excuse me. And so that's the genomic prediction that goes into a genomic enhanced EPD. So compared to the gene test, the genomic prediction basically takes all 20,000 genes in the cattle genome into account when it makes that prediction. And the validation becomes central to this process. The first thing that we do is we train the genomic prediction, so we estimate the effects of all 50,000 of those DNA variants. We then validate that genomic prediction, and when we do this validation, it's no longer a yes or no, does this genomic prediction work, because we know genomic prediction works. Now the question is, how much of the genetic variation in this trait are we actually explaining or accounting for in our genomic prediction? And once we've validated or measured how accurate and effective that genomic prediction is, we use it to select animals or to improve the reliability of EPDs. So what are some of the genomic technologies available to the beef industry? So basically all of the major beef associations, beef breeds, have a genomic enhanced EPD, and they publish those regularly. As I talked about, Angus was the first to develop those, and then several others have followed suit, and we continue to see breed associations work to generate enough data and implement that approach. And so those genomic enhanced EPDs produce more reliable and more accurate EPDs, especially for those young animals. The other thing that we've seen happen recently is that we have genomic predictions commercialized for commercial heifers. So now you can have an estimate of genetic merit for animals that are not registered. And so now a commercial cattleman can not only make genetic progress based on the sire side, based on the AI bulls he's purchasing or the cleanup bulls he's purchasing, but he can also make genetic progress based on the heifers that he's purchasing or the heifers that he's choosing to retain and develop into cows. Some of the commercial heifer products that are available is this GeneMax Focus test. It's marketed by Zoetis and certified Angus beef, and it produces predictions for average daily gain and marbling. It's going to combine these two traits into an index, and you're going to get that index score back on a 1 to 99 scale, with 50 being average and 99 being the cream of the crop. They really suggest that if you're going to purchase this GeneMax Focus test, that your cattle have at least 75% or greater Angus ancestry, and this test is going to cost you $17 per animal. Zoetis also markets a GeneMax Advantage test in partnership with Angus Genetics Incorporated. This GeneMax Advantage produces genomic predictions for the 17 different traits that AGI publishes EPDs for. But instead of overwhelming you with all of those EPD data, it really simplifies things for you and reports those EPDs back to you in 3 different indexes. And the indexes are straightforward. It's a cow advantage index that does exactly what it sounds like. It's a measurement of maternal genetic merit. It reports back to you a carcass advantage index, and that again does exactly what you think it would: performance in the feedlot, performance on the rail, how desirable that carcass is. And then it gives you an overall index, which is basically from conception to slaughter, how well those animals' progeny are going to perform, how well those animals' calves are going to perform. This is also reported on that 1 to 99 scale, with 50 being average and 1 being bottom of the barrel, 99 being cream of the crop. Again, 75% or greater Angus ancestry, and this test currently costs you $39. The Gelbvieh Association also has a genomic prediction profile available for commercial heifers with a high percentage of Gelbvieh ancestry. And this is going to give you predictions on a 1 to 10 scale, with 5 being average and 10 being cream of the crop for calving ease, maternal calving ease, weaning weight, yield grade, marbling, and carcass weight. And this test is going to cost you $26. The Red Angus Association also has a test, and in this scenario, you're going to get all of the EPDs and indexes published by the Red Angus Association. Even though you're going to get all of that EPD information back, I would still encourage you to focus on the indexes, because that's going to really simplify your decision-making process, and it's also going to focus your decisions on profitability. But you do have to show some sort of involvement with the Red Angus Association, which typically means that you've purchased a Red Angus bull and had his registration transferred into your name. The ranking on this system is going to be a 99 being the bottom of the barrel, 50 being average, and 1 being the cream of the crop. And this test is only going to cost you $25 per animal. So the heifer products that I've talked about so far really are breed-specific products. Genomic prediction works best if it's a breed-specific prediction, genomic prediction. But there's some tweaks that we do, and this is an active area of research to try to identify ways that we can make genomic predictions more reliable and more accurate across multiple breeds of cattle. So Igenity has a product that they've done kind of a neat little trick to identify DNA variants that are predictive across multiple breeds of cattle. And so they market these as their Igenity Gold profile and their Igenity Silver profile. Basically, the difference between these two profiles are the number of traits that you're going to get back to use in your selection decisions. Again, this is going to be on a 1 to 10 scale, with 5 being average and 10 being the cream of the crop. The Igenity Gold profile costs $40 per animal, and the Igenity Silver profile costs $25 per animal. And so if you have crossbred cattle that are kind of a mixture of the common breeds we use in the beef industry, this is really going to be the test that is going to be most reliable for the cattle in your herd for crossbred cattle. If you have straight bred cattle of some of those other breeds, those tests are going to perform better for you. Igenity also has Angus specific, I believe they're called an Igenity Angus Gold, Igenity Angus Silver, that are Angus specific profiles. Let's talk about some of the ways that we can measure our return on investment, or the value that we're receiving from these genomic products. So if you're new to this technology, how can you start using genomic prediction in your herd? One of the easiest ways, in my opinion, to do that is to simply purchase bulls that have genomic enhanced EPDs. This is going to give you several benefits. With a genomic prediction, the EPD value can go up or can go down, but the EPD accuracy, which really is a measure of the precision or reliability of that EPD, whenever we add data into the equation, that EPD accuracy is going to go up. So when we add in these genomic predictions, the EPD accuracy is going to increase. What that means is that you, as a bull buyer, are taking less risk in making a bad decision. The way that I really like to think about that is that you're in search of a heifer bull, you go to a bull sale, and you really want to buy a bull that has excellent genetic merit for calving ease. What you don't want to do is purchase a bull that you think is going to deliver in terms of calving ease, but after the first calf crop, you take him home and realize that he really isn't a calving ease bull. So this genomic prediction is going to give you the same information of about 10 to 20 progeny out of that bull. And the other thing that it allows us to do is to identify the genetic differences between fleshmate bulls. So now I want to talk to you about some data that we've collected at the Thompson Research Center that's part of the University of Missouri system. And one of the things that I'd point out in this picture of some cows and calves from that Thompson Research Center is that all of these animals have ear tags. All of these animals have been individually identified, really to start utilizing genomics on the female side of the equation, the female side of the pedigree. You really want to be able to individually identify those animals, at least as heifers, so that you know which test result goes with which heifer. And I think in the long term, as information and data becomes more valuable, that we're going to see more and more beef operations really put a premium on collecting data on individuals. So this is some results, some GeneMax Advantage results. And here I've plotted the total advantage index for the 2014 crop of heifers from that Thompson Research Center. And so I've ranked these animals from the highest scoring animal, which was a 96, down to the lowest scoring animal, which was a 43. And so if we look at this entire calf crop, the average score on this index was a 78. So the average calf out of this herd ranks higher than 78% of the Angus animals out there in the industry. So it's a pretty high caliber herd, and that's really changed over time through the use of artificial insemination, as we'll see in a little bit. So let's say out of this calf crop we decide that we're going to keep the top 60% of those heifers, okay? To meet our cow replacement needs, we need to keep the 60% of those heifers. And so when we draw that line, we see that the average changed from about a 78 up to a 68, okay? And so the average rank of those animals has increased. 1 percentage point in that GeneMax ranking is basically equivalent to $1.50 in actual dollars. So while that GeneMax Advantage test is reported to you as a percentile rank, it is an economic selection index underneath that is measured in dollars, just like any economic selection index. And so in this example that we've talked about, by selecting the top 60% of this heifer crop, that the average heifer is going to be about $12.50 more profitable per calf. And so if we talk about a heifer that's going to be in the herd and produce 5 calves, she's going to be about $63 more profitable in her lifetime. So these genomic predictions are actually giving you a measure of the economic value of those heifers. The other thing that I'll look at with these GeneMax results is kind of the genetic trend over time. But before we get to the genetic trend, I actually wanted to look at the actual performance over time in this herd. And so one of the first things we see is that birth weight is decreasing over time in this herd. So we can then infer that the calving ease is improving over time. The weaning weight is increasing by about 1.5 pounds per year. So between 2010 and 2011, that 1.5 pounds, is kind of a small amount. But when you start stacking that up over 20 years of selections, that 1.5 pounds becomes a pretty significant difference between where we started at and where our herd is at today. Just really highlighting that EPDs are an effective selection tool and do really change the performance of our herd. The other thing is that the marbling potential of these cattle is increasing over time, and that the carcass weight is increasing by about 4 pounds per year over time in this herd. And the GeneMax Total Advantage scores completely back this up. So back the cows that were in the herd in 2013, of those 2001 model cows, they on average they ranked in about the 15th percentile. So they were kind of towards the bottom of the barrel in terms of genetic potential compared to the rest of the Angus breed. What we see over time is that we're increasing that year average, that birth year average, by about 4 points each year, so that when we get to 2014, we're up over around 70% for the 2014 calf crop. Excuse me. So what that means is that the cows, those heifers born in 2014, are predicted to be $82 more profitable than the cows born in 2001. And as we talked about that phenotypic performance has been increasing over that time span, and we see that these genomic predictions are telling the exact same story. The other program that we have in Missouri is this Show Me Select Heifer Replacement Program. And so in 2015, we developed a new program as part of that where we gave a classification of a Show Me Plus heifer. A Show Me Plus heifer is simply a heifer that has a genomic prediction, whether that's a Seedstock heifer, a purebred heifer, a registered heifer with a genomic enhanced EPD, or a commercial heifer with some of the commercial heifer tests that we talked about a little earlier on. And so what we can see is the various premiums associated with different classifications. So we have kind of natural service, not this tier 1 versus tier 2 is whether they're sire identified, so tier 2 is sire identified. And so we see various premiums. What I'd like to point out to you here is that these heifers with genomic predictions saw a premium regardless of whether they were artificially inseminated or whether or not we had their sire identified. But one of the things that we wanted to do in this analysis is really take the heifer's consigner out of the equation. So we wanted to account for the consigner's reputation in terms of the price that they were receiving. And so when we accounted for that, we saw that these heifers with genomic predictions saw a premium of about $400. Okay, so what this statistical analysis tells us that in 2016, I would predict that heifers with a genomic prediction, a Show Me Plus heifer, will sell for $400 above the baseline. And so if we talk about a genomic prediction test costing between $25 to $75, that's a really nice return on investment, up to almost 1,500% return on investment to about 400% return on investment. So really providing some premiums for these heifers with the increased genomic information. So go back to this hype cycle. You know, this research and development phase is going to be a long period of time. There's going to be a lot of research spent on how we use genomics in the beef industry, and there's going to be a lot more that we can glean and reap out of the genome, because the genome really is a complex system. There's a lot going on. There's just so much we don't understand, and so as we continue to research, we're going to continue to learn more and more, and so these genomic predictions will change and be tweaked over time. But one of the things that I really can assure you about is that genomic prediction works, that it is providing value to the beef industry, and hopefully we can get to this point where we reach this plateau of productivity and we have a beef industry that really trusts and utilizes this technology to produce a more sustainable product. One of the resources I'd like to tell you all about is a new website that a group of us, including Dr. Weber, launched this summer called ebeef.org, and it's basically a web resource for you all to gain information about genetics in beef production. So this can be things like heterosis that Dr. Weber talked about earlier, all the way to what new genomic research is going on. And so there's various fact sheets on that ebeef.org website. There's frequently asked question videos, and we're constantly generating new content for that website. So it's an excellent resource. And here's some of my information, a blog that I run, and turn it back over to you all. I believe there's probably some questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Decker. I hope my technology is working here and that you all can hear me. First, I'd like to say thank you to both of our presenters. One of the things that NCBA does best is to bring folks together from across the cattle industry, provide the best information available for cattlemen. I certainly think we've achieved those objectives tonight with this great webinar. While Josh is preparing to moderate our question and answer session, I want to remind everyone that this webinar is provided free by NCBA as a service to the industry. If you are an NCBA member, I want to thank you for your investment in the future. If you are not, we'd love to have you join us in advocating for a profitable future for cattlemen. I also want to quickly encourage you to consider joining us in Washington, D.C., April 12th through 14th for our legislative conference this year. We will make an impact with boots on Capitol Hill, advocating for policies that allow us to operate more freely on our farms and ranches. You can visit beefusa.org or call your state cattlemen's association for more information on this important event. Josh, I'm going to hand it back over to you for the question and answers.
Thanks, Tracy, and you were coming through loud and clear. One question we had going back to Dr. Weber's presentation and the diagram, sort of a basic question, but I think it's a good one, and that is, in your example, you showed the broken genes on the sire side. So could that example be shown either way, or do broken genes usually come from the sire side is the question?
Great question, Josh, and I sort of glossed over that bit. It actually comes from both sides of the pedigree. The current data, and maybe Jared will chime in on this, a little bit of his experience, but each animal has a fair number of broken genes that they pack around. So we all have some baggage, if you will, so it's the idea that animals from different breeds are likely not to be broken at the same spot, and that's why we think maybe this sort of new perspective on heterosis makes sense. Jared, does that line up with your experience as well?
Yeah, basically, we think of these broken genes being specific to a breed, and so it really doesn't matter whether the broken gene is coming from the sire or the dam, and we wouldn't expect more to be coming from the sire or more to be coming from the dam.
Great. I've got a couple of other questions that get a little specific, but keep sending them in, folks out there in your chat box. One is, and I think this was answered a bit by Jared, but do genomic predictions increase EPD accuracy at the same rate or as accurately as increasing progeny data? So I guess what are the limits, and how does that compare to progeny data?
Yeah, so these genomic predictions are going to offer about the same amount of data as 10 to 20, maybe 30 progeny. So if you have an AI sire who has 1,000 progeny, the 10 to 20 progeny equivalents from a genomic prediction is just going to be kind of like a drop in the bucket compared to those thousands of actual progeny. Okay, where it gives us the most bang for the buck is when we have a young animal where we have either no data or we have it's individual performance data, but we don't yet have any progeny data out of it. And that's where we're going to see the biggest bump in that increased EPD accuracy or that increased EPD reliability. If you think about it on the female side of the equation, you know, a typical cow in your herd is never going to have 20 progeny. So on the female side of the equation, it really allows us to more precisely define her genetic merit.
Excellent. Another question, a little more technical. What % of genetic variance for a trait is needed before a SNP profile test is useful?
So typically when the genomic predictions were first released, they were explaining about, if my memory serves me correctly, about 30% of the genetic variation in the trait. So if you have, you know, a few thousand animals, that's about the ballpark that you're going to be in, is that 30 to 50% of the genetic variation is explained by the genomic prediction. As you get up to hundreds of thousands of animals, like the Angus Association is at, now you're going to be explaining 60 to 80% of the genetic variation for the economically important traits. One of the other things that I'd like to point out is the dairy industry really has grabbed onto this technology. And so earlier this year, the Holstein breed has genotyped over 1 million Holstein animals with these high-density SNP chips. So it's really something that's really influencing how dairy cattle are being selected.
Nice job. I'm glad that you got to answer that one, Jared. This is an interesting question. So, and I think either one of you might want to weigh in on this. If you take into account some of the theory that Dr. Weber discussed and both of you commented on with the crossbreeding being able to cover up for some potentially negative recessive traits, what would you estimate is the importance of heterosis and survivability if you take into account potential embryonic loss all the way through the extra longevity for an older cow, if that makes sense? Increased survivability throughout the production cycle from conception to through production.
Yeah, good and slightly complicated question. You know, the increase in reproductive rate of crossbred cows, just in terms of conceiving a calf and carrying that calf to term. Depending on if you're looking at cows or heifers, most of the literature says somewhere between 4 and 8 or 9% improvement in conception rate. And if you add that then to the sort of the positive improvements for, let's just take, I don't know, 4 to 9. Let's take 6 as the kind of mean number, 6 or 7. We can add about 2% calf survival to that. So it's not unforeseen to see about an 8% increase in weaning rate. So cows that were exposed to calves that actually made it to weaning. It's not atypical in the literature to see that sort of 8 to 10 number, 8 to 10% increase. And that sort of gets at the heart of why heterosis is so valuable to the system, is that the old adage, if we don't get a calf on the ground, we haven't done anything, is really true and has a huge impact on decreased unit cost of production, revenue stream to the operation. If you figure out, well, what's adding 5 calves to your calf crop per 100 cows worth versus adding, say, 20 pounds per head to weaning weight. One of those makes you a lot more money than the other one. So reproductive rate and fertility is really at the heart of crossbreeding, the improvement from crossbreeding. And we can take that sort of a step further in terms of sort of this idea of
those animals are more fit in the production environment, so they have less variation in terms of performance, particularly in the F1s, relative to environmental change. So you can think about them as maybe being more drought tolerant or resistant to variation in nutrient availability, all those sorts of things, because they've got this extra ability to sort of reproduce and perform even under stress. And in fact, the estimates for system level efficiency to weaning, so weaning weight per cow exposed, those numbers, as you get into more extreme environments, actually get higher, which is sort of a little hard to get our head around sometimes. But when we think about environments where they're really stressful in terms of either insect load, heat, humidity, forage availability, all those sort of things, the margin of advantage of crossbred cows over straight-bred cows actually gets bigger. So a lot of the work done at the Meat Animal Research Center was done in a really relatively nutrient-dense environment, one that was designed to maximally express genetic difference for additive traits when they were trying to discover breed differences. Those two experiments were the same ones, breed difference and heterosis. And so that had a tendency to minimize the effects that we could detect for heterosis, and yet they're still 20 to 25% in terms of magnitude. So,
and I'll give the same answer just in a slightly different way. So if we go in and we inseminate a group of cows and look at them basically 7 days later, we see upwards of 90% of those cows have what appears to be a viable embryo. Okay? If we go back at 45 days after insemination, we're down now to 60 to 70% of those cows having a viable embryo. And so in that first 45 days, we're losing 20 to 30% of those pregnancies. We're losing a good chunk of those pregnancies. So some of that, probably a large portion of that, is going to be due to the environment, but a portion of that is also going to be due to genetics. And so we expect within any beef breed that we'll find a handful of what we call these lethal DNA variants that are causing the embryo to be aborted, for the pregnancy to be lost sometime during the pregnancy. And we expect that many of those pregnancy losses are going to be early on in the pregnancy, probably in that first 45 days.
I know that is a question on a lot of folks' minds, so thank you, Jared, for going specifically there. Another interesting question, this one's a little more simple, but if you have a herd and you've never used genetic testing, and they don't specify whether this is commercial or purebred or any breed makeup, would you start by testing your calves, or would you start with the cows?
I think it makes sense to kind of start with the bulls, because that's, we all know how influential a bull is on a herd. The cows, if you own the cows, you're going to own the cows, and you're really probably not going to sell her until she's no longer productive. So I think it probably makes the most economic sense to start testing those heifer calves as you're deciding whether or not to develop them as replacements. So it really makes the most sense to test the calves.
And here's one for more along the lines of what Dr. Weber was presenting on. If you're crossbreeding and you have an Angus-based cow herd, explain the heterosis advantage of using a Brangus bull versus something like a Brayford, where you would not have any Angus in the bull, on the bull side.
Yep, great.
But
great
still
question.
but still maintaining the Bos indicus, I guess, is what he's asking in the cross.
Yep. So we'll use exactly the Brangus and Brayford examples. Both those are typically designed as 5/8, 3/8 products, where the 3/8 represents the Brahman or Bos indicus component. And so in both scenarios, if that's the sire breed used on straight Angus cows, that contribution, the Brahman component to the heterosis generated, is constant, if you will, and pretty substantial, in fact. Because remember, the Brahman F1 generates about 3 times as much heterosis as a Bostaurus F1 does. So then when we take the other 5/8 part, we've got 5/8 Angus or the 5/8 Hereford component. And obviously when we get Angus-Angus pairings from the sire and dam, that creates 0 heterosis, right? And so there's a marked improvement in heterosis in the Brayford side, albeit since we've already put Brahman in, you've already got a lot of heterosis in there. So I'm trying to think as a good way to sort of describe the percentage differences because they're proportional to breed fractions. So you would have, let's use weaning weight per cow exposed, and we'll divide up the let's say 25%, just so we've got round or decent numbers to work with. You would have roughly about 15% of that comes from, we'll use that as the 5/8 equivalent here, from the Bostaurus breed in that sire. And so you'd expect pretty substantial, about 15% more weaning weight per cow exposed in the Brayford over the Brangus in that particular example, due to the extra heterosis from the Hereford bit in the Brayford side. So
excellent, and we'll wrap up with one
complicated question. So
we'll wrap up with one final question. We've had a lot of questions chatted in, and if your question wasn't answered on the call, I will. If it's one I can answer, I'll answer it, or I'll forward it to our experts, and we'll try to get you an email response specifically to your question. But this final question is really interesting, I think, because it's sort of depending on how you look at it between the two presentations. Dr. Weber, you showed the advantage in longevity in those crosses, and then in a different slide in Dr. Decker's presentation, we saw the tremendous genetic improvement in those younger generations. So this question is, does it make sense to keep those cows less years so that you can more quickly see the genetic improvement that the younger generations are bringing in?
Yeah, good question. That all comes down to what's the capital investment you have in that cow as a replacement, and what's the swap to bring in a new, let's say, genetically improved female. And I'll echo Dr. Decker's comment is typically once we've got cows in production at the commercial level, the only time she gets to go away is when she fails. Most of the conventional data says cows are about 6 years of age before they break even relative to their development costs. I would argue, and I think there's probably some recent publications that would support this, that heifers that were built and put in production and had their first calf in either 2015 or will have it in 2016. A lot of those heifers are in the $2,800 to $3,200 price bracket if you bought them. It's probably going to take longer than 6 years to get them past a break-even point in their productive life. And so, why would we go to a position of, albeit the heifer that we bring in may be better genetic potential, but do we want to lock in a loss when we sell a cow before she's reached break-even just because we don't like her something? That something's got to be really expensive. So
the other thing,
practical take.
Yeah, and I really like Bob's answer and agree with it. And the one thing that I would add on to it is I think it's the decision that is less important is whether or not we keep that cow. I think once we've decided to once that cow is on the place, she's going to stay on the place. I think what is much more important is doing a good job selecting those replacement females and selecting the bulls that are the sires of those replacement females. So when I look at beef industry surveys that are saying actual birth weight is the #1 criteria producers are using to select bulls, that tells me that we're not getting messages across in terms of how valuable EPDs are and economic selection indexes are in selecting these cattle. And so instead of worrying about whether we should keeping a cow around, I think we really need to be worrying about, are we using the right tools to select those females and those bulls?
That's an excellent point, Jared. And I think so there's some really simple math to come behind that and support it. And it's, if you look at the contribution of bulls to the gene flow in your population, if you just consider sire and maternal grandsire of each cow you've got, the bulls you picked account for 3/4 of the gene flow in that cow. If we take the next generation of maternal great-grandsire in there, we're over 80% of the gene flow. So, being very cognizant and very deliberate in sire selection, particularly sires of bulls you're going to keep replacement heifers out of, really can pay some big dividends. And it's a really focused decision, right? I mean, even big producers, it's 5% of the inventory of your herd is bulls, 95% of it's cows. So it's a really good place to focus your efforts too, because it has a lot of impact.
Well, great wrap up there. I think those were some good take-home points to wrap it up. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Decker and Dr. Weber, for presenting a great webinar tonight, and we look forward to visiting soon, and thank you again for joining. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh, for the invite.